5 years. 5 years separated a man from the forest he loved and the unspeakable place where his earthly journey found its grim conclusion. Elias Vance, a man whose hands knew the weight of a rifle and the delicate nuance of a fishing rod, vanished into the vast, indifferent expanse of the Flathead National Forest in the late summer of 2018. It was not a sudden, violent disappearance, but a slow, creeping void that first manifested as a small, irritating worry, a missed call, a slight delay, before solidifying into the cold, crushing reality of a missing person case. He had kissed his wife, Sarah, told her he would be back before the second frost dusted the peaks, and driven his aging, olive-green pickup truck into the green maw of the Montana wilderness, seeking the quiet solitude that only the deepest parts of the American West can offer. That was the last moment of peace for the Vance family, the final frame of an ordinary life before the narrative took its irreversible, tragic turn. When Elias failed to return after the agreed-upon 4 days, Sarah felt the first sharp stab of dread, a primal, chilling anxiety far beyond the annoyance of a typical delay. She knew her husband. He was methodical, experienced, and deeply respectful of the clock she kept back home. Something was wrong. The initial missing person report, filed on a Tuesday morning, was met with the weary, practiced response of local law enforcement, accustomed to hunters getting turned around or suffering minor injury. They spoke of sprained ankles, forgotten supplies, and the swift changeability of mountain weather. The first 24 hours were characterized by a desperate, hurried effort to treat it as a routine search and rescue operation. Helicopters, their rotors beating a frantic rhythm against the ancient silence of the pines, began to crisscross the sectors Elias had indicated on his rough map. Ground teams, a mixture of county deputies and dedicated volunteers, began the arduous process of grid searching, their voices echoing hollowly through the canyons, calling a name that received no reply but the rustle of leaves and the sigh of the wind. Within 48 hours, the olive-green pickup was located precisely where Elias had intended to leave it, parked off a rarely used logging track, tucked discreetly beneath the boughs of an enormous ponderosa. The sight of the vehicle, pristine and undisturbed, offered no comfort. Rather, it deepened the unsettling nature of the mystery. Inside, his supplies were meticulously organized. A first aid kit, spare rations, and the keys on the dash. Everything suggested a man planning a return, not an abandonment or a flight. What was missing, however, was his satellite communication device, his heavy hunting rifle, and the small, antique silver pendant he always wore, a family heirloom depicting a fierce, stylized falcon. The initial assumption, logical and almost comforting in its simplicity, was that Elias had hiked into the deep woods and met with an accident. Perhaps a fall, perhaps an unforeseen blizzard, perhaps the sudden, territorial confrontation with one of the region's massive, silent predators. The search area was immense. 1,000 square miles of unforgiving terrain where a body could be swallowed whole by a ravine or covered by decades of natural debris, lost to all but the earth itself. The air itself seemed to resist the intrusion of the search parties, absorbing their hope and amplifying the dread. The investigators, led by Detective Marcus Thorne, a man whose face held the permanent etchings of too many hard years, wrestled with the conflicting evidence. On one hand, the picture was clear, a lone hunter, the mountain taking its toll. But Thorne felt the subtle, persistent pull of something unnatural. He knew the difference between a tragic accident and a forced absence, and the meticulous order of the abandoned truck whispered of a final moment that was too brief, too clean. He had his team perform a detailed perimeter sweep, covering ground far beyond the immediate parking area. It was here, in a small, muddy depression over 300 yards from the truck, that a tiny, almost invisible anomaly was noted, a faint, peculiar tire track. It was the tread of a heavy-duty, off-road vehicle, one significantly larger and different from Elias's aging pickup. It was found miles away from any major road, an inexplicable intrusion into the deep wilderness. But in the overwhelming scale of the search, And with the official narrative of an accidental disappearance already taking root, this small detail was cataloged, photographed, and ultimately dismissed as a logging truck's innocuous passing, a fleeting shadow quickly forgotten in the mounting pressure to find the missing man. The mountain was silent, but it was not the wilderness that truly held the secret. It was the chilling possibility that the man had not been claimed by nature, but by something far more calculated, far more cruel. The vastness of the forest became a terrifying metaphor for the vastness of the unknowns in this case. A boundless space where a hunter could simply cease to be, consumed not by bears or cold, but by human malice. The family's dread solidified into a profound, aching sorrow, but Detective Thorne, looking at the photographic evidence of that lone, inexplicable tire track, understood that the simple answers often concealed the darkest truths, and that the silence of the wilderness was a perfect accomplice to a crime that had yet to even be labeled as such. The search continued for another week, then another, until the coming of the harsh Montana winter forced the temporary cessation of all major efforts, sealing the mystery beneath a blanket of snow. Elias Vance was now officially a ghost, one of the countless souls swallowed by the American wild, his story suspended in a painful, agonizing ellipsis. The silver falcon pendant, the rifle, and the SATCOM remained unfound, and the single, strange tire track was nothing more than a blurred footnote in a file that was about to be officially marked cold. The 5 years that followed Elias Vance's disappearance were an agonizing tapestry woven from false hope and deepening despair. The initial frenzy of the search waned, replaced by the methodical, heartbreaking routine of a long-term missing person investigation. Every spring, as the snow receded and the forest exhaled its damp, earthy breath, the search teams would return, driven by the unwavering conviction of Sarah Vance, who refused to accept the finality of an official presumption of death. She funded private searches, consulted psychics in quiet desperation, and walked the perimeter of the designated search zones so many times that she knew the shape of individual rocks and the trajectory of the sun through the pines like old, weary friends. But the forest, as it had done for centuries, guarded its secrets with a cold, absolute silence. Aerial shots, reviewed repeatedly by investigators with high-definition scrutiny, revealed nothing but an endless, undulating carpet of green and gray. Thermal imaging scans, deployed with the hope of detecting any lingering organic matter, returned only the faint, ephemeral heat signatures of small animals. Detective Thorne and his dwindling team kept the case file open, but the truth was a heavy, inescapable weight. Without a body, without a single piece of credible evidence pointing away from the accident theory, the investigation was stuck in a state of suspended animation, a constant, low-frequency hum of frustration. Thorne understood the corrosive effect of this uncertainty on the family. The not knowing was a slow-acting poison, worse than any horrific certainty. He watched Sarah age 5 years in a single season, her youthful optimism replaced by a deep, weary set to her jaw, her anxiety curdling into a desolate, quiet dread. He would visit her, not with new information, but simply to sit in her living room, drinking the lukewarm coffee that had become the unofficial currency of the missing person file, and recount the details of the initial search, the organized state of the truck, the strange absence of struggle. He often brought up the single, inexplicable tire track, that momentary distortion in the accepted reality of the case, but it led nowhere. The local logging companies were checked, the tread patterns analyzed, but the print could not be conclusively matched, and the sheer volume of forestry vehicles operating in the region made the effort moot. It was an open loop that offered no closure, a haunting possibility that remained firmly within the realm of speculation. The case officially entered its cold phase, transferred to the back shelves of the Major Crimes Unit. The file itself became a heavy, manila tomb, occasionally dusted off by a new intern looking for a challenge, but ultimately destined for the archives. Elias Vance was memorialized by a stone bench overlooking a valley he loved, his name etched into the granite beneath the words, "Lost to the Mountains," a statement that felt both comforting and profoundly, disturbingly wrong to Thorne. The narrative had settled, tragedy, not crime. The mountains had claimed their own. Yet, 500 miles away, in a forgotten corner of rural Idaho, the threads of the case, unseen and utterly unrelated, were being pulled taut by the relentless, grinding wheels of a completely different investigation. The focus there was not on a missing hunter, but on a clandestine, organized criminal enterprise that specialized in illegal narcotics and the brutal spectacle of staged animal combat. For months, the FBI and a multi-jurisdictional task force had been monitoring a network operating out of derelict, isolated properties, an operation so deeply rooted in the area's remote farm culture that it had become nearly invisible. Their main target was a fortified, windowless barn on a neglected property known locally only as the Pit. The property itself was surrounded by a tall, rusting chain-link fence nestled deep within a scrubland valley hours away from any major highway. It was a place designed for secrecy, a theater of cruelty hidden in plain sight. Detective Thorne, still haunted by the Vance case, was nearing his retirement, contemplating the one case he had truly failed to solve, the one narrative that felt incomplete. He had learned to live with the silence of the forest, but the imagined silence of Elias's final moments continued to echo in his mind. He never quite believed the simplicity of the accident theory. The organized items in the truck, the lack of a note, the strange tire track, all spoke of an interference, a brief, violent transition that had occurred not in the vastness of the wilderness, but at the periphery of its reach, a dark deed committed before the true hike had ever begun. He remembered the feeling of dread in Sarah's voice, the anxiety that was never about a lost man, but a man who had been taken. Now, the narrative structure of the case, so rigid and fixed in the minds of the media and the public, was about to be violently and irreversibly fractured, demonstrating that the greatest threats often come not from the cold indifference of nature, but from the calculated, depraved cruelty of humankind. The silence of the mountain was about to be broken by a shout from an unexpected, hellish place. The major discovery that shattered 5 years of assumptions came not through a breakthrough in forensic anthropology or a sudden confession, but through the mundane, brutal necessity of a coordinated law enforcement raid. It was 3 a.m. on a cold, pre-dawn Friday morning when the task force, having executed their final warrants, breached the fortified doors of the compound known as the Pit. The operation was swift and clinical, designed to neutralize the dogfighting ring's operators and seize the animals and evidence. The atmosphere inside the main structure, the derelict barn, was a dense, visceral fog of dread, the smell of neglect, blood, and fear clinging to the aged wood and concrete. The initial objectives were met quickly, arrests made, animals secured. But in the final methodical sweep of the structure for hidden stashes and additional evidence, a young, veteran investigator named Ruiz shone his powerful utility light up into the dusty, cobweb-draped rafters of the barn. The light's beam cut through the gloom, momentarily illuminating the high, seldom-seen upper structure. And there, against the dark, heavy beams, was the sight that instantly and violently ripped the thread of the operation away from its initial focus, replacing the horror of animal cruelty with the shock of something far more personal, far more macabre. What he saw was not a bag of narcotics or a hidden weapon, but a human form suspended high above the earthen floor. It was a sight of utter, horrifying certainty, a final act of desecration that spoke of something beyond simple murder. The body had been there for a significant, indeterminate amount of time, expertly hidden from the casual glance of the barn's frequent, brutal occupants, yet visibly present as a grim, silent trophy. The scene was immediately sealed, the atmosphere shifting from the organized urgency of a raid to the hushed, stunned gravity of a major, unanticipated crime scene. The question was immediate, electric, and terrifying. Who was this man, and how had he become the dark, forgotten occupant of an illegal dogfighting pit hundreds of miles from the Montana wilderness? The identification was a painstaking, almost agonizing process. The state of the remains demanded forensic experts be flown in immediately, but the investigators worked with what they had. The body was held fast by a thick, industrial hemp rope, tied with a precise, cold knot around one of the central support beams. The clothing, though severely degraded by time and environment, eventually yielded faint, familiar details: the tattered remains of high quality, specialized hiking boots, a fragment of heavy, forest green wool. But the final, definitive identification came not from dental records, which would take hours, but from a small, deeply personal artifact found clutched in the decayed remnants of a coat pocket. It was the antique silver pendant, the stylized falcon, described in excruciating detail 5 years earlier by Sarah Vance. The discovery sent an instantaneous, visceral shockwave across 3 state lines. Elias Vance, the hunter lost to the mountains, had been found, not in the silent embrace of the wilderness, but suspended in the fetid, claustrophobic air of an Idaho barn. The reality was a stark, agonizing contrast to the 5-year-long narrative of natural tragedy. The youthful joy of the hunter preparing for his solitary retreat had been exchanged for this horrific, certain end. The vast, indifferent beauty of the Flathead Forest was now innocent. The true predator was revealed to be human, its dark domain a fortified, hidden structure designed for viciousness. Detective Thorne, called out of his near retirement and flown immediately to the scene, stood in the dust and the shadow of the barn, his gaze fixed on the grim relic being carefully lowered. He felt a profound sense of vindication, mixed with the cold weight of absolute dread. His gut feeling, the inexplicable tire track, the too neat abandonment of the truck, it all coalesced into a horrific certainty. This was never an accident. This was a calculated act of violence, a disappearance designed to be blamed on the unforgiving mountain. The vastness of the wilderness had been used not to kill Elias Vance, but to conceal the dark truth of his capture and the terrible, calculated journey that had brought him to this final, ignominious resting place. The sheer audacity of the murderers to not only kill a man, but to display his remains as a morbid, silent warning within their vile operation, spoke of a profound, chilling psychopathy. The initial investigation into a missing person had been instantly and irrevocably replaced by a complex, multi-state homicide case, one now requiring a complete, agonizing reevaluation of every single assumption, every discarded theory, and every forgotten piece of evidence. The story of Elias Vance was no longer a tragic tale of the wild. It was a dark narrative of human cruelty, and the new line of inquiry, cold and unforgiving, was about to begin. The silence of the barn, unlike the silence of the forest, was heavy with the weight of unseen witnesses and untold horrors, ready to yield its long-held secrets. With the shattering confirmation that the suspended remains belonged to Elias Vance, the entire focus of the investigation and the narrative itself underwent a traumatic transformation. The accident theory, the 5 years of methodical, frustrating searches in the forest, were all instantly relegated to a prologue of sorrow. The main story was now one of cold-blooded murder and criminal concealment. The new line of inquiry began inside the claustrophobic, foul-smelling confines of the pit, the isolated barn now transformed into a meticulous crime scene. Forensic teams worked under a heavy canopy of dread, their every movement a silent acknowledgement of the appalling injustice of the victim's final placement. The first crucial detail was the rope itself, thick and rough, the kind used for industrial hauling or heavy mooring, far removed from the thin nylon of a hiker's cord. The knot, analyzed by specialists, was not a simple hanging knot, but a complex, specific mariner's hitch, suggesting a degree of grim professionalism in the act of suspension. It was a detail that immediately narrowed the potential suspects, pointing not toward random opportunists, but to individuals with a specific, specialized background, possibly connected to the sea or heavy industry, a stark deviation from the expected profile of a local, opportunistic killer. Detective Thorne, his gaze now sharpened by horrific certainty, focused his attention on the immediate vicinity of the body's final location within the rafters. Why here? Why the morbid display? The body was hidden enough to avoid casual detection, but present enough to serve a purpose. Was it a ritual? A warning? Or simply the most convenient, concealed storage the killers could devise in their vile arena? The area yielded little in the way of conventional evidence. The atmosphere and the passage of time had ensured that, but a painstaking sweep of the dust-caked overhead beams and the adjacent hayloft did offer a critical, physical contradiction to the initial wilderness narrative. Embedded in the thick, dry straw and partially coated in a hardened layer of grease and animal detritus was a small, rusted piece of metal. It was immediately recognizable to Thorne from the original case file, though he had never seen the artifact itself. A miniature, hand-forged arrowhead, one of a dozen Elias Vance was known to collect, always carrying a few of them as good luck charms. This was the irrefutable link, the piece of the Montana wilderness dragged 500 miles to this place of human degradation. The key forensic analysis, however, came from the body itself. The manner of death was critical. The initial examination concluded that the immediate cause was not exposure or animal attack, as presumed by the mountain narrative, but a violent, conclusive trauma to the skull, inflicted by a blunt object, likely at the moment of his capture. The suspension had been post-mortem, a final, chilling act of desecration. This fact destroyed any remaining possibility of the crime being a spontaneous act of violence within the dogfighting ring itself. Elias Vance had been killed, likely near the logging trail, and transported here. He was not a bystander who saw too much. He was a victim brought to them. The shattering of the initial assumption led to a fundamental reversal of the entire investigation. The focus was no longer on where Elias died, but why he was targeted and how he was moved. The entire timeline shifted back to the single, isolated moment 5 years prior when he parked his truck. The team pulled the photograph of that strange tire track, the one dismissed as a logging vehicle, from the archive file. It was now not just an anomaly. It was the starting point of the crime. Analysts compared the tread pattern from the 2018 photograph with the tire patterns known to be used by the organized crime network that operated the pit. The results, slow in coming but definitive, sent another visceral jolt through the investigation. The track belonged to a specific model of heavy, all-terrain utility vehicle frequently utilized by the leaders of the dogfighting ring for transporting animals and supplies through difficult, unpaved terrain. The wilderness had been a mere stage for the interception. Elias Vance hadn't vanished. He had been taken, and the Silent Mountain had offered the perfect, pre-packaged alibi. The question moved from who killed the hunter to why would the operators of a dogfighting ring travel 500 miles to abduct a man who was ostensibly just a hunter in a remote part of Montana. The vastness of the national forest, once the enemy, was now revealed to be a cruel cloak, its silence having concealed a meticulously planned, targeted abduction that spoke not of opportunity, but of an old, dark connection. The new line of inquiry demanded a forensic deep dive into the victim's life. Not just his love for the outdoors, but his entire network of contacts, his personal beliefs, and any small, seemingly inconsequential acts of resistance or engagement that might have brought him to the attention of a vicious criminal network hundreds of miles away. The narrative had shifted from the tragedy of the elements to the insidious, long-reaching tentacles of human evil, and the hunt for the motive was now the only path to the men who had orchestrated this devastating deception. The image of the rusted arrowhead, a piece of Montana ancient history mixed with the grime of an Idaho contemporary horror, became the macabre symbol of the case's dark, twisting trajectory. The final, chilling arc of the Elias Vance narrative required investigators to completely disregard the picture of a solitary hunter and reconstruct the life of a man who had become a threat in an entirely different context. The initial breakthrough came not from a massive database search, but from a careful, old-fashioned review of Elias's personal papers, a box Sarah Vance had kept untouched for 5 years. Amidst the maps and fishing licenses, Thorne found a cache of local environmental protest materials and municipal planning documents. Elias Vance, the passionate hunter, was also Elias Vance, the deeply dedicated local conservationist, and his passion sometimes extended into the realm of local government and community activism. His secondary job, often dismissed as a minor side role, was serving on a regional commission dealing with the ethical management of certain animal populations and land use, a position that in the rural West often put him at odds with individuals operating outside the lines of legality. The critical link was established when detectives cross-referenced the names of the key figures arrested in the Pitt raid with local court records near Elias's home. The leader of the dogfighting operation, a man named Silas Reed, was a shadowy figure with a minor, decades-old rap sheet in the Montana region involving animal cruelty and illegal trapping. A man who had been the subject of a small, focused complaint filed by the very commission Elias Vance sat on. It was a connection so faint, so seemingly minor in the grand scheme of criminal enterprise, that it had been entirely overlooked. But in the world of organized rural crime, seemingly small acts of bureaucratic resistance are often met with brutal, outsized retribution. Silas Reed had been forced to pay a negligible fine and relocate a small operation due to the commission's pressure, an administrative slap on the wrist that, to a man of his brutal narcissism, was interpreted as an unforgivable act of personal aggression. Elias Vance was not a random victim, lost to the mountains. He was a targeted victim of revenge, a conservationist whose principles had inadvertently crossed the path of a powerful, depraved criminal. The investigation revealed the terrifying calculus of the crime. Reed had been forced to move his base of operations temporarily after the commission's ruling. Learning of Elias's planned hunting trip from local chatter, the loose, inescapable network of small-town talk, Reed saw a perfect, silent opportunity for both revenge and concealment. The initial plan was likely not the grand theater of dogfighting, but a cold, final act of violence, one that the wilderness would take the blame for. The final moments of Elias Vance, pieced together through the confession of a peripheral co-conspirator who broke under the weight of the 5-year-old secret, were recounted not in dialogue, but in stark, narrative reportage. Elias, having parked his truck and preparing his pack for the hike, was intercepted by 2 men, Reed and an associate, who had utilized the heavy utility vehicle, the one responsible for the unexplained tire track, to access the remote logging trail. There was a brief, violent struggle, the evidence of which had been quickly erased from the muddy depression. Elias was subdued, killed with a blunt force trauma to the head, and his body wrapped. The silver falcon pendant, ripped from his neck during the fight, was crudely shoved back into his pocket, a small act of carelessness that would, years later, undo the entire plot. The rifle and SATCOM were thrown into a ravine, never to be found, further cementing the illusion of a man lost to a fall or an animal. The shocking, additional truth was that the body was transported immediately. Reed, already preparing to relocate his operation fully to the Idaho barn. The pit saw the suspended remains as a powerful, silent display of dominance to his inner circle, a gruesome testament to the lengths he would go to neutralize a perceived threat, no matter how small. He used the knot he learned years ago in the fishing industry to secure the body high in the rafters, a macabre trophy in his theater of cruelty. For 5 years, the men who frequented the pit conducted their heinous business directly beneath the quiet, suspended tragedy of Elias Vance, the victim's final resting place mocking the initial public narrative of a wilderness accident. The profound injustice of the case was now fully revealed. The mountains were innocent. The woods had not taken Elias. The illusion of natural tragedy had been a sophisticated, deliberate mask for the coldest kind of human retribution. The final conviction of Silas Reed and his accomplice, achieved primarily through the physical evidence of the pendant, the arrowhead, and the analysis of the tire track, brought a somber, devastating closure. It was the horrific certainty of a crime that was not about money, power, or passion, but about a small, petty slight that had been avenged with a brutality so disproportionate it defied simple comprehension. Elias Vance had gone into the wilderness seeking peace, only to be dragged back into the darkest recesses of human depravity, his fate sealed not by the elements, but by a chilling, calculated act of organized revenge that had successfully silenced the victim and fooled the world for half a decade. The story ended not with triumph, but with a quiet, wrenching reflection on the true nature of evil, often meticulous, often petty, and always devastatingly close.